The phone was still warm in my hand when the world I thought I knew collapsed into something I didn't recognize. I was sitting at my kitchen table in Charlotte, North Carolina, on a Tuesday morning in late October. The kind of morning that feels ordinary right up until it isn't. The coffee was fresh. The light coming through the window over the sink was that pale gold color it gets in the fall, soft and unhurried. I had a copy of the wire transfer confirmation on the table in front of me. $75,000. Sent 6 weeks earlier to an account under the name Devereaux Capital Solutions, LLC, my son Caleb's company. Or so he told me. I wasn't reviewing it out of suspicion. I was reviewing it because my accountant, Harold Jennings, had asked me to pull all major transactions from the past quarter for our year-end review. I'd printed it without a second thought. Set it beside my coffee. Glanced at it the way you glance at something you've already made peace with. And then my phone rang. The number had a 242 area code. I didn't recognize it. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something I still can't explain what made me answer. Hello? Mr. Thomas? A woman's voice. Young. Slightly breathless, like she'd been running or laughing. Background noise. Music, water, the particular echo of a large open space. This is Danielle. Danielle Mercier. Camille's sister. Camille. My daughter-in-law. Caleb's wife. Danielle, I said slowly. How are you? I'm wonderful. Thank you. We're having the best time. The resort is absolutely beautiful. She paused. I just wanted to call and say thank you for making all of this possible. Caleb told us you insisted on treating the whole family. That is so generous of you, Mr. Thomas. Truly. My mother hasn't stopped talking about it. I set my coffee cup down. I'm sorry, I said. My voice was very quiet. Where are you right now, Danielle? The Bahamas, she said, and I could hear the smile in it. Atlantis Paradise Island. We've been here 4 days. Caleb got us the ocean suite. Mr. Thomas, it's gorgeous. Why didn't you come with them? Caleb said you had some business to handle back home. I don't remember exactly what I said to end that call. Something polite. Something that gave nothing away. I have spent 63 years learning that your face and your voice are the last things you should ever let an enemy read. And in that moment, for the first time, I had to apply that lesson to my own son. I sat at that table for a long time after I hung up. The coffee went cold. The gold light moved across the floor and faded. And I looked at that wire transfer confirmation, $75,000, and I made a decision that I have not regretted for a single day since. Before I take you back to where this really began, I want to ask you something directly. How many times have you given someone everything, trusted them completely, and found out later that the trust was the weapon they used against you? If that question hits somewhere deep, you're in the right place. Drop family first in the comments. Subscribe if you haven't already. And tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. Because this story belongs to all of us. Now, let's go back. 6 weeks before that phone call. Back to the night my son came to my door with tears in his eyes and a folder full of lies. My name is Raymond Charles Thomas. I am 63 years old. I was born and raised in Charlotte, North Carolina, the second of 4 children of Harold and Evelyn Thomas. My father drove a city bus for 31 years. My mother taught 3rd grade at Billville Elementary for 26. They were not wealthy people, but they were precise people. Precise about integrity, precise about accountability, precise about what it meant to carry the Thomas name with your head up. I attended North Carolina A&T State University on a partial academic scholarship. Graduated in 1984 with a degree in civil engineering and spent the next 35 years building a career at Morrison and Reed Infrastructure Group. where I eventually became a senior project director overseeing bridge and highway contracts across the Southeast. I retired 18 months ago with a pension, a portfolio I built carefully over decades, and a home in the Berkeley Downs neighborhood that I'd owned outright since 2009. I tell you this not to boast. I tell you this because you need to understand the kind of man my son was raised by, and because you need to understand what it cost me, emotionally, not financially, though it cost me that too, to watch everything I'd modeled for him get used against me like a tool. Caleb Raymond Thomas is 34 years old, my only son. His mother, my ex-wife Denise, passed away from breast cancer 11 years ago. And after that, it was just the two of us navigating a grief that neither of us had a proper language for. I think that's where it started, if I'm being honest with myself. Grief can make you generous in ways that aren't always healthy. You give more because you're afraid of losing more. I gave Caleb more patience, more money, more benefit of the doubt, because I had already lost his mother, and I was not prepared to lose him too. He married Camille Mercier 4 years ago. She is a pretty woman from a Haitian-American family in Miami, Florida. Warm smile, good manners in company. The kind of woman who knows exactly when to turn the charm on and when to let it cool. I noticed that about her early. I chose not to make too much of it. Caleb had started Devereaux Capital Solutions 2 years into the marriage, a financial consulting firm, he said, helping small businesses with cash flow management and investment strategy. He had an MBA from Wake Forest, which I have largely paid for. He had an office in the South End neighborhood of Charlotte, which I had co-signed the lease on. He had business cards, a website, a LinkedIn profile with a professional headshot. He looked, by every surface measure, like a man building something real. What I did not know, what I would only come to understand fully in the weeks after that phone call, was that Devereaux Capital Solutions had never had a single paying client. Not one. The office was real. The cards were real. The website was real. The business itself was a performance, maintained at considerable personal expense, designed for one specific audience of one, me. But I didn't know any of that on the night of September 8th. When Caleb knocked on my door at 7:15 in the evening, with a leather portfolio under his arm and eyes that were red at the edges, I remember thinking he looked thin. He'd lost weight since I'd seen him at the Labor Day cookout, maybe 10 pounds. His shirt, a blue Oxford he'd owned for years, looked slightly loose at the shoulders. I noticed these things the way fathers notice things, not with alarm yet, just with the low-frequency attention that never fully turns off. "Dad," he said, "I need to talk to you." I stepped back and let him in. We sat in the living room. He set the portfolio on the coffee table between us and folded his hands on top of it. Camille wasn't with him, which I noted. He said she was at her mother's in Miami for the week. A family thing. He said it quickly, the way you say something you want to get past. "I'm in trouble," he said. "The business is in serious trouble." He opened the portfolio. Inside were printed financial statements, bank statements, what appeared to be vendor invoices, and a letter from a collections agency. He walked me through it methodically. A major client. He named them as Hartwell Property Group, a commercial real estate firm out of Raleigh, had pulled out of a contract unexpectedly, leaving a $200,000 gap in projected revenue. There were operating expenses that had continued during the gap. There was a line of credit at Newbridge Capital that was 30 days from default. There was, he said, a very narrow window to refinance and stabilize. He needed $75,000, a bridge loan from me to him, he was careful to say. Not a gift. A loan with a promissory note at whatever interest rate I thought was fair, to be repaid within 18 months. "I've never asked you for anything like this," he said. And that was almost true. I had paid for his undergraduate education, contributed significantly to his graduate degree, co-signed his office lease, and given him $12,000 5 years earlier when he and Camille were buying their first car and came up short. But he had never asked for anything at this scale, and the framing of it as a loan, the careful, businesslike framing, carried weight with me. I asked him questions. He had answers for all of them. The Hartwell situation, the refinancing timeline, the projected recovery. He had numbers, percentages, dates. He had a document he called a recovery plan. It was thorough. It was detailed. It was, I now know, completely fabricated. But sitting in my living room that night, watching my son, my only son, the boy I'd coached in Little League and driven to SAT prep and sat beside in a hospital room while his mother took her last breath, watching him lay out what looked like a genuine crisis, I did what I had always done. I believed him. I told him I would review the documents and get back to him within a few days. He nodded, thanked me quietly, and left. I walked into the door and watched his taillights disappear down the street, and I stood there for a moment in the cool September air, thinking about my father, who would have asked harder questions than I had. And then I went back inside and started reading through the portfolio. Now, and this is the part I want you to sit with, because I think a lot of you know exactly what I'm about to describe. The documents were convincing. Not perfect. Looking back now, there are things I should have caught. The Hartwell Property Group letter had a logo that didn't quite match their actual corporate branding. One of the bank statements had a formatting inconsistency on the transaction timestamps that a forensic accountant would have spotted immediately. The collections notice was from an agency I'd never heard of and couldn't find with a quick online search. But I wasn't looking for fraud. I was looking for a reason to help my son. That is the most important thing I can tell you about how this happened. I was not a foolish man or a careless man. I was a loving man who had been targeted precisely because of that love. Caleb knew. He had always known that my greatest vulnerability was him. 3 days later, on September 11th, I called him and told him I would help. I had my attorney, a woman named Patricia Holloway, who has handled my affairs for 15 years, draft a promissory note. Caleb came in, signed it without hesitation, shook Patricia's hand, and thanked her professionally. The next morning, I wired $75,000 from my personal account at Truist Bank on Camel Road to Devereaux Capital Solutions, LLC. He called me that afternoon. "Dad, I don't have the words," he said. "I'm going to make you proud. I promise." "You already have," I told him. "Just take care of your business." 43 days later, his wife's sister called me from a luxury resort in the Bahamas to thank me for a vacation I knew nothing about. What you need to understand is what happened in the weeks between those two moments, because the $75,000 was only the surface of it. Under the surface was something I have been too loyal, too willfully blind, to see for years. And when I finally started looking, really looking, I found a pattern that went back further than I ever wanted to admit. Let me tell you about the first time I noticed something was off with Caleb and money. It was 6 years ago, before the marriage, before the MBA, when he was working his first job at a wealth management firm in uptown Charlotte. He called me one afternoon and mentioned, casually, that he'd had to cover a colleague's lunch because the colleague forgot his wallet. Small thing. But then he told me the colleague's name, a man I happened to know through a mutual contact. And when I mentioned it later in conversation, that man had no memory of the lunch at all. I filed it away. I told myself I'd misremembered or misunderstood. That's what you do. That's what love asks of you, to find the innocent explanation and accept it. But there were other moments. There was the time Camille's car needed repairs, and Caleb told me it was going to cost $3,800, and I gave him $4,000, and 6 weeks later, I saw the car in their driveway with the same dent it had always had and the same worn rear tire. There was the time he told me he donated to a church building fund at Greater Refuge Temple, our family's church, where my mother was a founding member, and when I asked Deacon Williams about it, the deacon said they hadn't received any such donation. There was the time he borrowed my pressure washer for a weekend job. He said he was doing for a neighbor and returned it 2 weeks later with a cracked housing and an explanation about an accident that didn't quite add up mechanically. None of these things, standing alone, would have broken the image I had of my son, but they were threads. And on the morning of October 21st, sitting at my kitchen table with Danielle Mercier's voice still ringing in my ears, I finally began pulling them. I pulled them one by one, slowly and carefully, the way I had spent 35 years pulling at structural problems in bridges and roadways, not with emotion, but with method. Because emotion would have had me calling Caleb immediately, confronting him in the heat of my shock, giving him the chance to construct a new story before I understood the full shape of the old one. That was not going to happen. I was Raymond Charles Thomas. I had built a career on patience, on thoroughness, on never signing off on a structure until I understood every load-bearing element. My son had counted on me to be a loving father. He had forgotten that I was also an engineer. What would you have done in this moment? Would you have called him right away? Or would you have done what I did? Waited, watched, and gathered? Tell me in the comments. And if this story is speaking to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. I started with the business. Patricia Holloway connected me with a forensic accountant named Dennis Okafor, a quiet, precise man from Lagos who had spent 20 years untangling financial fraud for corporate litigation firms before going independent. I met him at his office in Blantyne on the afternoon of October 22nd and laid everything on the table. The promissory note, the portfolio Caleb had shown me, the wire confirmation, and every document I'd collected over the previous 24 hours. Dennis reviewed the materials without expression. Then he looked up at me over his reading glasses and said, "Mr. Thomas, how quickly do you need to know?" "Immediately," I said. He nodded. "Give me 72 hours. While Dennis worked, I made 2 other calls. The first was to a woman named Gloria Hartwell. I'd found the real Hartwell Property Group through their website and called their main number, who confirmed, after a brief and politely confused conversation, that her company had never had any business relationship with anything called Devereaux Capital Solutions, and had never heard of my son. The second call was to Newbridge Capital's customer service line. After navigating their automated system and speaking with a representative named Marcus, I confirmed that there was no loan account in the name of Devereaux Capital Solutions, LLC, and no record of my son in their system at all. In 72 hours, Dennis Okafor delivered a 14-page report. The company had no revenue. The financial statements Caleb had shown me were fabricated using commonly available spreadsheet software. The bank statements were altered copies of real statements with transaction figures changed. The collections notice was from a shell entity with no regulatory registration. The office lease, the one I'd co-signed, had been sublet to a graphic design firm 8 months ago for $1,400 a month, with Caleb collecting the sublease payments while I continued to believe the office was his. The $75,000 wire I'd sent had been distributed as follows: $18,500 to Atlantis Paradise Island, resort in the Bahamas for a 10-day stay in an ocean view suite. $11,200 to a luxury car rental service in Nassau. $9,700 to a series of restaurant and entertainment charges across Nassau and Paradise Island. $14,600 to a personal shopping account registered to Camille Mercier Thomas. and the remaining $21,000 to a savings account in Camille's name at a credit union in Miami, Florida. I read that report 3 times. Not because I didn't understand it, because I needed to understand it completely, in every dimension, before I took a single step forward. My son had not made a mistake. He had not gotten desperate and done something foolish under pressure. He had constructed, over a period of months, a detailed, deliberate fraud, specifically designed to extract a large sum of money from his father. And his wife had been part of it. Not peripherally, centrally. The account the money flowed into was hers. The shopping, the hotel, the rental cars. She was there for all of it. I want to be transparent with you about something. There is a version of this story where I called my son the moment I finished reading that report, where I screamed at him, where I said every word that was burning in my chest and let the fire consume whatever was left between us. I understand that version. I have compassion for the man who would have done that. But I am not that man. I am the son of Harold Thomas, who drove a city bus for 31 years and never once, in my entire childhood, raised his voice in anger in our home. Not because he had no anger. He had plenty. But because he understood something that took me decades to fully absorb, that the man who controls himself controls the situation. The man who loses himself gives the advantage to whoever is watching. Caleb was going to be watching very carefully when I made my next move. I intended to give him nothing to work with. I called Patricia Holloway on the morning of October 25th, 4 days after Danielle's phone call, and I told her what Dennis had found. She was quiet for a moment on her end of the line. Then she said, "Raymond, I need you to come in this afternoon." I was in her office at 3 p.m. We sat across from each other at the long table in her conference room, Dennis Okafor's report between us, and Patricia laid out the landscape with the directness I had always valued in her. What Caleb had done constituted, at minimum, wire fraud under federal statute. The fabricated financial documents were evidence of fraud in the inducement. The promissory note he'd signed gave me a civil remedy independent of any criminal proceeding. The sublease arrangement on the office, collecting payments on a co-signed lease without my knowledge, created additional exposure for him. And the involvement of Camille, through the accounts and the direct transfer of funds, meant she was not a bystander. "What do you want, Raymond?" Patricia asked me. Not what are your options. What do you want? She knew me well enough to ask the real question first. I thought about it for a long moment. I thought about my father. I thought about my mother, who used to say that forgiveness is for you, not for them, but accountability is for everybody. I thought about Caleb at 7 years old, asleep in the back seat of my car on the drive home from his first A&T football game, his face completely peaceful. I thought about sitting beside Denise's hospital bed in her last week, holding her hand while she slept, and the way Caleb had stood in the doorway of that room looking lost in a way I recognized because I felt it too. And then I thought about $75,000 wired to a resort in the Bahamas, and a woman on the phone thanking me for a vacation I'd unknowingly paid for, and 14 pages of documentation proving that my son had looked me in the eyes and performed grief and desperation as instruments of theft. I want the money back, I said. Every dollar. And I want him to understand completely what he did. Not just that he got caught, what he actually did. Patricia nodded. We can do that. 2 days left before that realization would fully arrive, but we had work to do first. Patricia filed a civil suit on October 27th. Thomas v. Devereaux Capital Solutions, LLC, and Caleb Raymond. Thomas, in Mecklenburg County Superior Court, citing fraud in the inducement, breach of contract on the promissory note, and unjust enrichment. She simultaneously filed a motion to freeze the accounts Dennis had identified: the Camille Mercier Thomas Credit Union account in Miami, the personal shopping account, and the Devereaux Capital Solutions operating account, which still held approximately $4,200 of the original transfer. She also sent a formal legal notice to Caleb's attorney. He had one, a man named Garrison Webb, who handled his business filings, and who I suspect had no idea what his client had been doing, notifying them of the claims and the account freeze. On October 28, at 9:47 in the morning, my phone rang. It was Caleb. I let it ring twice. Then I answered. Dad. His voice was different. The warmth was gone, or rather the performance of warmth was gone. What was underneath? It was something harder and more cornered. I just heard from Garrison. What is this? I think you know what it is, I said. Dad, I can explain. Caleb. I said his name the way my father used to say mine when a lecture was unnecessary because the point had already been made. Just the name, with the full weight of everything behind it. I have Dennis O'Coffer's report. I have the wire records. I have the hotel confirmation from Atlantis Paradise Island. I know where the money went. Every dollar. Silence. I'm not calling to argue with you, I continued. I'm calling to tell you that my attorney has filed suit and that the accounts have been frozen. If you want to discuss a resolution, you'll do it through Patricia Holloway's office. That's all. Dad, that's all, Caleb. I hung up. Now, I want to pause here for just a moment, because I know some of you are thinking, how? How do you hang up on your own child? How do you sit in that stillness after? I'll tell you how, because I had already done the grieving. In those 4 days between Danielle's call and this one, alone in my house, I had let myself feel every part of what this was. The betrayal, the humiliation, the sorrow of it. I had sat with my grief like an old friend, and I had let it move through me. So when Caleb called, I had nothing left to lose by being calm. The storm had already passed inside me. What remained was clarity. And clarity, I have learned, is the most powerful thing a person can carry into a difficult room. What would you have said to him in that moment? What would you have been able to hold back? I genuinely want to know. Tell me in the comments below. And if you're watching this and you've been in a position where someone used your love as a loophole, share this video. Someone in your circle needs to see it today. Caleb retained a second attorney within 48 hours, a litigator named Dale Hendricks out of Uptown Charlotte, who specialized in civil defense. Hendricks reached out to Patricia on October 30th and proposed a settlement discussion. Patricia, on my instruction, agreed to one meeting. That meeting happened on November 4th, a Thursday afternoon, in Patricia's conference room on South Tryon Street. I was present. Caleb was present. His attorney was present. Camille was not, which told me something about how Caleb had framed his defense strategy. She was in Miami. She had, from what I later learned, retained her own separate counsel there. Caleb walked in looking like a man who had not slept in a week. He had lost more weight. There were shadows under his eyes that weren't entirely about the legal situation. Some of it was the marriage, I suspected, fracturing under the pressure of exposure. He sat down across the table from me and could not hold my eyes for more than a second at a time. Dale Hendricks presented their position. Caleb acknowledged that the business documents he'd shown me contained inaccuracies. He attributed this to desperation and poor judgment rather than deliberate fraud. He proposed repayment of $50,000 over a 36-month period, with the remaining $25,000 forgiven as a family matter. I let Hendricks finish. I looked at my son. Then I looked at Patricia and nodded. Patricia opened her folder and slid a single document across the table to Hendricks. My client's position, she said, is full repayment of $75,000, plus court costs and attorney's fees, totaling $81,340 within 90 days. In exchange, Mr. Thomas will not pursue criminal referral to the U.S. Attorney's Office for wire fraud. That offer expires at close of business on Friday. Hendricks looked at the document. Caleb looked at the document. Then Caleb looked at me. For the first time in that meeting, he held my eyes. "Dad," he said quietly, not to Hendricks, to me directly. "Please." This was the moment I had been preparing for. Not the legal maneuvering, not the account freezes, not the forensic report. This moment. My son looking at me across a conference table, asking me to be his father instead of his creditor. And here's the truth. Part of me wanted to. Part of me, the part that still held that image of a 7-year-old boy asleep in my back seat, wanted to slide that document back across the table and say that we'd figure it out as a family, that love could absorb this, that I could be the kind of father who forgave everything. But I had spent 63 years watching what happens when love is offered without accountability. I had seen it in the families of colleagues and members of my church, in stories I'd heard at every stage of my life. Love without accountability doesn't save people. It preserves the conditions that allow them to keep causing harm. To themselves, to others, to everyone who trusts them next. "This is me being your father," I said. "The best thing I can do for you right now is exactly what Patricia just put on that table. You understand what you did, Caleb. You understand it completely. And the only path forward that respects both of us is the one that begins with full accountability." He looked down at the table. "You have until Friday," Patricia said. He signed on Friday afternoon at 4:23 p.m. a structured repayment agreement, $81,340, to be paid in full within 90 days, secured against his and Camille's joint assets, including the equity in their home in the Steel Creek neighborhood. Equity that, Patricia had discovered, was substantial enough to cover the full amount. The house had appreciated significantly since their purchase, and they had been making payments for 4 years. When the math was done, the repayment was uncomfortable but entirely possible. Camille's separate attorney in Miami had apparently advised her, once she understood the scope of the legal exposure, that cooperation was the only rational option. The account freeze on the Miami Credit Union, where $21,000 of my money sat waiting, had focused her thinking considerably. In the weeks that followed, I learned more about the full architecture of what Caleb had built. The performance of a successful business, maintained across 4 years at a cost of roughly $6,000 per month in operating expenses, funded initially by a personal loan he'd taken out without my knowledge, and later by a series of smaller requests to Camille's family, requests that had been presented to them as temporary bridge financing for a thriving company. Her family in Miami had given him money too. Not as much as I had, but they had given it in good faith, and it had gone the same way. When that information reached Camille's mother and her brother Gerald, the marriage, which had already been under severe structural stress, did not survive the month of November. Camille filed for separation in early December. The Steel Creek house went on the market in January. My $81,340 was paid in full by February 8th. Money from the home sale proceeds handled entirely through the attorneys. I did not speak to Caleb during that period. Not once. The silence was not punishment. It was the space that accountability requires. I want to be clear about something. I did not feel victorious when that payment cleared. I did not feel the satisfaction that people sometimes describe when justice arrives. What I felt was something quieter and more complicated than that. A kind of sorrow mixed with relief. The sorrow of a father who had to watch his son fall so that his son might eventually stand. The relief of a man who had held his own integrity intact under the most personal pressure he had ever faced. It is now late February. The light in Charlotte is still thin and cool in the mornings. The kind that reminds you winter isn't quite finished yet. I have my coffee at the kitchen table most mornings, the same table where I answered Danielle's call 4 months ago. I've started attending a men's fellowship group at Greater Refuge Temple on Wednesday evenings, something I'd been meaning to do for years and kept putting off. There are 8 of us, men between 50 and 75, and we talk about things that men our age were not always taught to talk about: loss, pride, the way love can be used against you, and how you hold on to it anyway. I think about my father a lot, about the way he moved through difficulty, not around it, through it. He used to say that a man's character is not what he does when things are easy. It's what he does when the person he loves most in the world is the one making things hard. Caleb called me 3 weeks ago. First time we'd spoken since the conference room in November. He didn't call to apologize, exactly. He called to tell me he was seeing a therapist, a man named Dr. Ellison at a practice in South End. He called to tell me he had taken a position at a financial consulting firm, a real one, doing actual work for actual clients. And he called to tell me that he understood, now, the difference between what he had done and what he told himself he was doing. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When he finished, I said, "I hear you, Caleb." That was all. It was enough for now. The road back between a father and a son who has done something like this is not a short one, but roads don't scare me. I spent my whole life knowing how to build them. The $75,000 is back in my Truist account on Camel Road, plus the $6,340 in costs and fees. The money was never really the point. The point was this, that a man who has built his life on integrity does not abandon that integrity when the test becomes personal. That love without accountability is not love. It is enablement wearing love's clothing. And that the truth, no matter how long it takes, no matter how far it travels, has a way of making phone calls from the Bahamas at the worst possible moment. Karma doesn't always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it arrives as a woman's voice, bright and unsuspecting, calling to say thank you for a trip you never approved. Sometimes it arrives in 14 pages of forensic accounting. Sometimes it arrives in a house going on the market in January, in a marriage that couldn't survive what it was built on. And sometimes, the best times, I think, it arrives as a phone call from a son who is finally, slowly, beginning to understand the cost of who he chose to be. I am Raymond Charles Thomas. I am 63 years old. I have built bridges across this state that will stand for 100 years. And I am still, after everything, my father's son. Thank you for being here with me today. If this story reached you somewhere real, if it said something you needed to hear, please share it with someone who needs it too. Leave your like, subscribe if you haven't, and tell me in the comments, what does accountability look like in your family? I read every single one. I'll see you in the next one.